Hey everybody, Deathblade here with another Chinese fantasy novel FAQ. My hair is a bushy mess, so I still have this hat on, and it is COVID-19 lockdown, so it's entirely possible that my son might burst in at any moment. I'm doing a video that I feel a little bit awkward about making this video, but believe it or not, I do get this question all the time about my story, how I became a translator, and also the origin of my name Deathblade. It is kind of an over-the-top name, so how did I come up with that name? I've talked about this subject in videos and also on podcasts and interviews and whatnot, but I've never put my story and my background into a central location that I can point people to. So that is the purpose of this video. Going forward, it will be easy for me to explain my story by saying, go check out this video, instead of me explaining it myself. So I'm not going to go into my entire life story. I'm getting up there in age nowadays, so there's a lot of backstory in my life, but that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is to explain my name and also to explain how I became a translator. And basically this part of my life, the story starts in around the year 2000 when the movie Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon came out. I saw it, I'm pretty sure on opening night in a theater here in San Diego, and that movie really captured my attention. I just thought it was so awesome. As soon as I went home from seeing that movie, I started looking up what this movie was, its background. I found out it was part of a 5-book series of books that was wuxia. I was like, what is this wuxia stuff? Of course, back then I didn't know how to pronounce it, and I pronounced it wuxia, like I think a lot of people do when they first see it. And I started researching it, found out what it was. In the subsequent years, I watched every wuxia movie that I could get my hands on. I was primarily interested in stuff from around the 90s and later. I wasn't particularly interested in stuff from before then. Nowadays, fast forward many years later, I'm actually a lot more interested in those old Shaw Brothers movies. I think they're great, but back then I wasn't as much interested in that. I was interested in the 90s and post-90s CGI special effects movies, and I watched as many as I could find. Also around that time, I was looking online for the translations of the books. I was thinking, man, this Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon movie is so cool, and it's based on a series of books. The series must be translated, right? Wrong. Around that time though, the fan translation scene exploded. There was a website called spcnet.tv that still exists today. You can still find my old posts on there. I basically went onto that website to read the translations of these novels. There were tons of them being translated at the time. None were complete, but I read as many as I could find, as long as the translation quality was okay. There were a lot of translations back then, as there are nowadays, that are just really, really bad, either partially machine translated or perhaps translated by people who maybe English is their second language and they're not particularly good at writing English. I kind of skipped those. I didn't really like them very much, but I did read a ton of this fan translated wuxia. And of course I was interested in commenting on the forums, and so I created an account, and the username I picked was Deathblade. The reason I picked that username Deathblade was because I used to play StarCraft a lot back in the day, and Warcraft as well, but primarily StarCraft. And I picked Deathblade as my StarCraft handle. The reason I picked it as my StarCraft handle was mostly just because I thought it was kind of a silly, over-the-top name. Seemed appropriate for, like a Protoss warrior or something like that. I don't know, I thought it was funny. And so that was my online nickname at the time in the early 2000s, and that was the username I picked for SPCnet. Even though it was wuxia that sparked my interest specifically in especially Chinese stuff, I'd always been kind of interested in Asian stuff. Fast forward a few years, and after having spent several years working in the family business of real estate after graduating high school, I decided that I wanted to change, and so I went back to college. Now, I had never gone to college after graduating high school because I went right into the family business. But a few years later, I decided to go in college, and I spent a few years getting a degree in art, believe it or not, and animation. As I got toward the end of my college career, I decided I wanted to take a vacation to China, and I did. I spent a month traveling, on one of the popular tour routes, and I just was super excited and interested, and I thought it was so cool. I came back, and I kind of took learning Chinese seriously. Before going on the trip, I had done what all the travelers do. I got some CDs, and I learned how to say hello and where's the bathroom. At least I think I could say those things. I never really used that on the trip, but after I got back, I was super interested in learning Chinese, and so I took a crash course in Pinyin, and then from then on out, I was just teaching myself Chinese. I never went to any specific formal classes, but I took advantage of just about every opportunity I could think of and used every tool that I could think of, whether that was podcasts or buying textbooks, taking advantage of language exchange with a tutor, or watching movies and breaking down the subtitles. I did just about everything and taught myself Chinese. One of the big things I used was spaced repetition software. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about what that is right now. If you want to, you can go to my website, which is jeremybai.com. That's jeremybai.com, and go to my Chinese learning FAQ. I have links and descriptions there talking about that. That was the main way that I learned Chinese, to be honest, was those spaced repetition software learning systems. So fast forward a couple years from that point, and my career after graduating from college took me into the games industry. I was working in casual games. I worked initially for a production company in Southern California. Then I ended up moving to New York City. And by this point, I had actually been taking Chinese seriously for a couple of years. So when I moved to New York City, I actually got a job in a game company in New York City whose offices were in the World Financial Center. That's right next to the World Trade Center. At this point, of course, the 9/11 attack had happened many years before, so there was a big hole in the ground, and I basically was working next to there. On the other side, about I guess 10, 15, 20-minute walk was Chinatown. And so I thought, wow, this is a no-brainer. Here I am. I've been learning Chinese for a couple of years. I've traveled to China. I gotta move to Chinatown. And so I did. I moved into Chinatown, not to the tourist section, but into the sort of non-tourist section that a lot of people, at least back then, I don't know how it is now, but back then it was called Little Fuzhou, because there's a lot of people from the Fujian province, Fuzhou area. So that's where I lived for a couple of years, and man, that was a very, very Chinese environment. I spent a lot of time roaming the streets there, and if you close your eyes and don't look around too carefully, you can almost think you're in China at that point. As I was at that company for a couple of years, and eventually reached the point where I could tell that the writing was on the wall, that things weren't really doing very well for that company. So I decided I'm going to move to China. Now, on the one hand, it was actually kind of a sort of fortuitous decision, because that company eventually was sold and, it's gone now. So I basically got a job at a college in China, and I went straight from New York City, Chinatown, right to China. I didn't move to Beijing, didn't move to Shanghai. I went to a really small place because I thought that was cool. I really wanted to go to a small place, not a big place. And so there I ended up in China. Even having lived in Chinatown for a couple of years and being really sort of immersed in that culture, I can tell you that life in China is way different than it is in America. But that's not the point of this video. The point is that I was in China, and after I arrived in China, I realized I had made a big mistake when I started learning Chinese. When I first started learning Chinese, I thought, you know what, there's no reason for me to learn Chinese characters. There's pinyin, which is the romanized way to express the Chinese language. I thought that's more than enough. But after I was in China and looking around and seeing there's literally no English, no pinyin, it's all just Chinese, I came to the realization that, wow, I probably should learn how to read Chinese. Now, I had been making sort of efforts here and there over the years, but nothing really serious. So at that point, I want to say something like maybe 3 or 4 years into my time studying Chinese and being immersed in the language and the culture in one form or another. I decided I really need to improve my reading. Now, I was also an English teacher at that time, and I always mentioned to students and to the parents of the students, because the students were often younger ones, I would always say, if you really want to improve your English, you need to include reading in your learning and review schedule. And then I thought, wow, I'm not applying that same advice to myself. So I decided I'm going to do that. I'm going to include reading. Now, what am I going to read? The newspaper? Not really very interested in the news. Textbooks? No. And then I was thinking, you know what is one of the things that kind of got me down this path to begin with? Wuxia. I was thinking, wow, I remember back in the day I used to be so interested in that stuff. Maybe I'll give it a shot again. So I found the shortest wuxia novel I could possibly find, which is called 7 Killers by Gulong, and I downloaded it onto my phone and I read it. Now, it wasn't super easy, but it wasn't super hard. You can, on phones especially nowadays, you can have pop-up apps or dictionaries where you can load a block of text and you just hit the character, it'll pop up the definition. It makes it very easy to kind of make a first attempt at reading something. So I read that novel, I got to the end of it, I thought, wow, that was actually easier than I thought. And then I was thinking, wow, remember that website SPCnet? What if I went there and I posted a translation? And the idea was so cool to me because I had read so many fan translations and thought it was so interesting back in the day, and so I decided, you know what, I'm going to do that. I'm going to publish, or I'm going to post a translation of this novel I just read, 7 Killers, and that's what I started doing slowly but surely. Now, of course, I had already made an account on SPCnet under the username Deathblade, so I went back to my old account. Sure enough, it was still there, and I started posting those translations under Deathblade. Now, years started to go by. I finished 7 Killers. I picked up another novel to translate, which was Heroes Shed No Tears, and I did another one which was called Kung Fu by Giddens Ko. I did another one which was Dragon King with 7 Stars, and all of those you can find on my website jeremybai.com in various forms or on different locations. As I got to the fourth translation, that was about the time that the novel Stellar Transformations was becoming extremely popular on SPCnet. This is before the days of Wuxia World. For those of you who know about Wuxia World, Stellar Transformations was getting really popular, and then one of the forum moderators on SPCnet, whose username was Renwoxing or RWX, he started posting a similar novel to Stellar Transformations, and that was called Coiling Dragon by the same author and in the same universe. And Coiling Dragon also started to get very popular as well. And this is while I'm doing Dragon King with 7 stars, my last novel-length traditional wuxia novel. Those two are just going crazy. At a certain point, Renwoxing RWX, he goes and starts his own website called Wuxia World, and a few months later, he messaged me and asked me if he could call me. So he called me. I was in China, I'm pretty sure he was in the United States, and he asked me if I would be interested in joining him or at least posting my translations on Wuxia World. And so I said sure. So I copied over the Gulong translations, which were Hero Shed No Tears, 7 Killers, and Dragon King with 7 stars. I finished Dragon King with 7 stars on Wuxia World, posting it, and then he asked me what was I interested in doing next. At first I said I wanted to do an original novel. He suggested I do a translation. In the end I decided to do a translation, and when I asked him what his suggestion for what he suggested to me to do, he said, well, there's a novel that's really popular on Qidian.com right now. It's called 我与方天, and of course that's I Shall Seal the Heavens. I checked it out, and I have a whole video about I Shall Seal the Heavens, which I'll put right there. So I started posting the translation of I Shall Seal the Heavens on the early Wuxia World, and the rest is history. So that's basically my story really in a nutshell of how I got from being a random guy in America to going to China and then becoming a Chinese translator on Wuxia World. Again, if you're interested in learning Chinese or becoming a translator, obviously before becoming a translator you gotta learn Chinese. I do have that FAQ. I'll put a link in the description below now that I think about it so that you don't have to try to find it on my website. I'll put the link in the description below, and then you can click around on my website to find all of the different translations that I mentioned. And so that's it. That's how Deathblade, the Chinese translator, came to be. I hope it was informative. If you have questions, please do leave them in the comments below. I try to reply to as many as possible. And if you'd like to support my work and support this channel, you can check the links in the description below. That's it for this video. I'll see you next time. God Salam.